Let me acknowledge the First Nations of this place. I bring greetings from Cape York Peninsula. I'm grateful for the Cairns Institute for indulging my love of the poetry of John Milton, and specifically Paradise Lost. Milton hoped his epic would fit audience find, though few. And I could hardly hope for more. Structure of my lecture is in 8 parts. The poem, Poetic Destiny, Milton, England's Rebel, The Devil's Party, Satan, Envy and Eve, Milton's Theodicy, Literary Memory, and the End of Genesis. And I'm hoping to thread throughout 4 themes on a canvas, if only lightly. These are the poem's sheer intellectual scope and Milton's poetic ambition. Secondly, I want to talk about Milton's 370-year-old spell. Thirdly, the heaven and hell within the human mind. And lastly, the next epic. We start with the poetry. No words can speak better than its own. We start in the beginning of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heaven and earth rose out of chaos. Or, if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount, while it pursues things unattempted, yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine, and what is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Say first, for heaven hides nothing from thy view, nor the deep tract of hell. Say first, what cause moved our grand parents in that happy state, favoured of heaven so highly, to fall off from their Creator and transgress his will? For one restraint, lords of the world besides. Who first seduced them to that foul revolt? The infernal serpent. He it was whose guile, stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind. What time his pride had cast him out from heaven, with all his host of rebel angels, by whose aid aspiring to set himself in glory above his peers, he trusted to have equalled the Most High, if he opposed and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, raised impious war in heaven and battle proud with vain attempt. Him the almighty power hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky with hideous ruin and combustion, down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire. Who durst defy the omnipotent to arms, 9 times the space that measures day and night to mortal men? He, with his horrid crew, lay vanquished, rolling in the fiery gulf, confounded, though immortal. But his doom reserved him to more wrath, for now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. Around he throws his baleful eyes that witnessed huge affliction and dismay, mixed with obdurate pride and steadfast hate. At once, as far as angels can, he views the dismal situation, waste and wild. A dungeon horrible, on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades, where peace and rest can never dwell, hope never comes, that comes to all but torture without end. Still urges and a fiery deluge, fed with ever-burning sulphur unconsumed, such place eternal justice has prepared for those rebellious. Here their prison ordained in utter darkness, and their portion set as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the centre thrice to the utmost pole. Oh, how unlike the place from whence they fell. There the companions of his fall, o'erwhelmed with floods and whirlwinds of tempestuous fire, he soon discerns, and weltering by his side, one next himself in power and next in crime. Long after known in Palestine and named Beelzebub, to whom the archenemy and thence in heaven called Satan, with bold words breaking the horrid silence, thus began: If thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed, from him who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness, didst outshine myriads though bright. If he whom mutual league, united thoughts and counsels, equal hope and hazard in the glorious enterprise, joined with me once, now misery hath joined in equal ruin. Into what pit thou seest, from what height fallen, so much the stronger proved he with his thunder. Until then, who knew the force of those dire arms? Yet not for those, nor what the potent victor in his rage can else inflict, do I repent or change, though changed in outward lustre, that fixed mind and high disdain from sense of injured merit, that with the mightiest raised me to contend, and to the fierce contention brought along innumerable force of spirits armed, that durst dislike his reign, and me preferring his utmost power with adverse power opposed in dubious battle on the plains of heaven, and shook his throne. What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield, and what is else not to be overcome. That glory never shall his wrath or might extort from me, to bow and sue for grace with suppliant knee and deify his power, who from the terror of this arm so late doubted his empire. That were low indeed, that were an ignominy and shame beneath this downfall, since by fate the strength of gods and this imperial substance cannot fail. Since through experience of this great event, in arms not worse, in foresight much advanced, we may with more successful hope resolve to wage by force or guile eternal war, irreconcilable to our grand foe, who now triumphs, and in the excess of joy, sole reigning holds the tyranny of heaven. Everything yields to the poetry. Everything must. Not Samuel Johnson, William Blake, or T.S. Eliot, nor any voice of commentary or literary criticism in the 350 years since could add or detract from this power. Least of all anything we say today. So what then is my purpose? It is to urge you to pick up Paradise Lost again. With our copy in the bookshelf, we have made many attempts since first obliged to read certain passages at high school or university, perhaps one of its 12 books, and put it down again. Samuel Johnson identified this problem in his Life of Milton when he wrote, "Paradise Lost is one of the books which the reader admires and lays down and forgets to take up again. None ever wished it longer than it is. Its perusal is a duty rather than a pleasure. We read Milton for instruction, retire harassed and overburdened, and look elsewhere for recreation. We desert our master and seek for companions." I too grappled with this work since high school. I was looking for Shakespeare in Milton and could not find him. This is a different species of language and poetry to his near-in-time predecessor. Everyone is familiar with the sensation Shakespeare excites. Your brain is set on fire, and the neurons in its deepest regions enlivened. Milton does the same, but the effect is not so direct and not easily won. The enjambed blank verse, which Milton invented in Paradise Lost, is not so readily unlocked. Probably his sternest critic, because most credible, T.S. Eliot, writing 250 years after, was right when he said that this poetry is oral. He wrote, "To extract everything possible from Paradise Lost, it would seem necessary to read it in two different ways. First, solely for the sound, and second, for the sense. The full beauty of his long periods can hardly be enjoyed while we are wrestling with the meaning as well. And for the pleasure of the ear, the meaning is hardly necessary, except insofar as certain key words indicate the emotional tone of the passage. Now, Shakespeare or Dante will bear innumerable readings, but at each reading all the elements of appreciation can be present. There is no interruption between the surface that these poets present to you and the core. I know what Eliot means. My breakthrough came one evening when I picked the poem up again and read aloud the opening passage with which I started this lecture. Bizarrely, my son was playing AC/DC's Thunderstruck on his Angus Young signature Gibson SG as Satan and his horrid crew stirred to life on the lake of fire. The vista opened, and this poem's genius finally revealed itself. There could be no turning back. From then on, it could not be put down. What an epiphanous moment. It was like entering the Accademia to see Michelangelo's David for the first time, having only seen it in art books. Or Madrid's Sofia Museum and seeing Picasso's Guernica. Or approaching Gaudi's La Sagrada Familia from the street. Or reading Anna Karenina for the first time as a 17-year-old. Paradise Lost cannot be grasped by silent, inside-the-head reading. It must be read as Milton dictated it to his amanuenses with full voice. Sing, heavenly muse. Epic poetry is not to be read like drama. Various audio books, including one produced by the BBC on the 400th anniversary of his birth, makes the mistake of trying to dramatise Paradise Lost as if a Shakespearean play. I esteem highly Blackstone's audio book, narrated by the minor English-American actor Ralph Cosham. Following the written text with Cosham's audio book, I highly commend as a way to bring sound and meaning together. Samuel Johnson summarised Milton's epic as follows. The subject of an epic poem is naturally an event of great importance. That of Milton is not the destruction of a city, the conduct of a colony, or the foundation of an empire. His subject is the fate of worlds, the revolutions of heaven and of earth, rebellion against the supreme king raised by the highest order of created beings, the overthrow of their host and the punishment of their crime, the creation of a new race of reasonable creatures, their original happiness and innocence, their forfeiture of immortality, and their restoration to hope and peace. David Scott Caston, whose edition I also commend, writes that Paradise Lost is unrivaled in its intellectual scope and poetic ambition. To me, Milton is to Shakespeare as Einstein is to Darwin. Shakespeare and Darwin are concerned with the human, and Milton and Einstein are concerned with the universe. Let me turn to poetic destiny. John Milton was born into prosperity on 9 December 1608. A precocious scholar from childhood, his brother testified to the burning midnight oil. He was filling the vessels of Mnesimone, the Greek goddess of memory, from whence his great poetry eventually sprung. His religious radicalism was installed by his tutor Thomas Young. He attended St. Paul's School, London, where he learned Greek and Latin. Milton was undergraduate at Christ's College, Cambridge, and received his master's there in preparation for Anglican priesthood. However, he returned home and undertook a further 6 years of self-directed study supported by his father. He read everything As well as fluent in Latin, Greek, and Italian, he learned Hebrew, French, Italian, Spanish, Old English, and Dutch. He became what has not improbably been described as the most learned figure in the history of letters. He toured the continent and met Galileo, whom he references in Paradise Lost as the Tuscan artist. Let me extract another passage in Book 1. It follows Beelzebub's response to Satan upon awakening in hell. He scarce had ceased when the superior fiend was moving toward the shore. His ponderous shield, ethereal temper, massy, large, and round, behind him cast. The broad circumference hung on his shoulders like the moon, whose orb through optic glass the Tuscan artist views at evening from the top of Fezole or in Valdano to descry new lands, rivers or mountains in her spotty globe. His spear, to equal which the tallest pine hewn on Norwegian hills to be the mast of some great admiral were but a wand. He walked with to support uneasy steps over the burning marl, not like those steps on heaven's azure, and the torrid climb smote on him sore besides, vaulted with fire. Natheless he so endured, till on the beach of that inflamed sea he stood and called his legions, angel forms, who lay entranced thick as autumnal leaves that strew the brooks in Volumbrosa, where the Etrurian shades high overarched embower, or scattered sedge afloat, when with fierce winds Orion armed hath vexed the Red Sea coast, whose waves overthrew Busiris and his Memphian chivalry, while with perfidious hatred they pursued the sojourners of Goshen, who beheld from the safe shore their floating carcasses and broken chariot wheels, so thick bestrown, abject and lost lay these, covering the flood, under amazement of their hideous change. From age 19, Milton knew his destiny was to write the greatest work of literature in the English language and achieve immortal fame. Milton's poetic destiny took possession of him from youth. He wrote forlornly in his 7th sonnet, "How soon hath time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. My hasting days fly on with full career, but my late spring no bud or blossom showeth." He was 23, so anxiety about his literary progress was clearly premature. Nevertheless, it came late. Other than juvenile poems and his middle years, Milton's poetic promise would not yield its ambitious fruit until his revolutionary political work in Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth ended in smoking ruins. Milton was an intellectual engine in the Puritan Republic, serving as its chief propagandist and Latin secretary, responsible for communicating with European governments. Trying to induce heaven on earth consumed Milton's middle years. There was no time for his nascent promise to come to fruition. I want to dwell momentarily on what it means to summon a life, to know the unknown inside yourself, or the unknown that is as yet some seed or some deep well accumulating memory, to incubate one's destiny with no inkling whether and how one's talents and sense of self would manifest in the world. No foreknowledge, but, to use Milton's most frequent adjective, adamantine certainty that one would produce great art, almost as surely as the predestination he abjured in Calvinism. If Michelangelo's burning destinies were soon revealed, then Milton's remained obscure and susceptible to extinction. Had his oeuvre ended up with the onset of blindness, his place in the pantheon of English poets was as assured as his friends Andrew Marvell and John Dryden. Had his revolutionary politics ended as it perhaps might have, hung, drawn, and courted, then his name would still appear in the anthologies of English verse today. Comus, Lycidas, and other minor works leading up to Paradise Lost assured him his place in literary history. But his greatest work lay still before him. Not until he voided death, with help from his friends, not the least Marvell, and could no longer read or write, infirm and blind, would his muse visit his dreams, and the deep wells of learning and memory stream forth verse, the like of which the world had not seen since Homer or Virgil. This is his description of the process of inspiration. If answerable style I can obtain, of my celestial patroness, who deigns her nightly visitation unemployed, and dictates to me slumbering, or inspires easy my unpremeditated verse. Since first this subject for heroic song pleased me long choosing and beginning late. The English Revolution was failed, and with the restoration of Charles II, Milton, unrepentant and restrained, briefly imprisoned and under fear of retribution for his role in the Republican government, not the least for having written the regicide treatises justifying the execution of Charles I, had no choice to continue politics. The Republic was dead. His life's work in politics was over. What remained for him, blind and decrepit, facing ridicule and opprobrium from the royalists, was the as yet unfulfilled promise of his poetic destiny. Let us now turn to Milton, England's rebel. The great irony of the contemporary view of Milton is he is the dead white male par excellence of the Western literary canon. And yet it is hard to think of any poet more radical in his time than he. If Satan was heaven's rebel and Adam and Eve rebelled paradise, then John Milton was England's rebel. Hilton was the consummate arguer. Public argument through treatise was his great renown, and he was a master of polemic rhetoric and vehement dialectic. When after the first 10-book edition of Paradise Lost was republished, with amendments following a 12-book structure, he added summaries at the beginning of each book entitled The Argument. He was making a case justifying the ways of God to man. Earlier, Milton wrote a controversial treatise advocating grounds for divorce. His Areopagitica is one of the first defences of freedom of speech. The positions he argued were highly contentious and against the powers of the day. The positions, he was a Republican who worked assiduously for the old cause in the prime of his life, held a senior position in the Commonwealth's government, and wrote in justification of the beheading of monarchs. Milton was a radical not just in his writing, but in political practice. He ardently sought for the Republic to succeed in Britain. And yet by the end of the 20th century, Milton, who lived his last days destitute, would become the very symbol of patriarchy and privilege, the number one villain of the Western canon. If there were a statue of him at Christ's College, it may well be vulnerable to stern retrospective judgment today. He may have escaped justice at the hands of Charles II, but how such a radical would come to be seen as such an archetype of all that is supposedly bad in the pantheon of English and Western literature is a strange wonder. Moreover, if you believe, as Samuel Johnson and I do, that his Paradise Lost is indeed one, if not the, finest productions of the human mind, then the retrospective view of English poetry's greatest rebel is more the pity. That contemporary and future audiences may not come to know this piece of art, for such silliness troubles me. It is now a free gift of humankind available on the World Wide Web. As many as can be encouraged to should partake. Witness this scene he conjures when Satan chests death at the gates of hell. Each at the head levelled his deadly aim, their fatal hands no second stroke intend, and such a frown each cast at the other, as when two black clouds with heaven's artillery fraught came rattling on over the Caspian, then stand front to front, hovering a space, till winds the signal blow to join their dark encounter in mid-air. Samuel Johnson's is the clearest enunciation of his great gifts. He wrote, he seems to have been well acquainted with his own genius and to know what it was that nature had bestowed upon him more bountifully than upon others. The power of displaying the vast, illuminating the splendid, enforcing the awful, darkening the gloomy, and aggravating the dreadful. He therefore chose a subject on which too much could not be said, on which he might tire his fancy without the censure of extravagance. Let me indulge another passage. When sin and death sense that Satan has succeeded in his enterprise, death says to his mother, "Go whither fate and inclination strong leads thee. I shall not lag behind, nor err the way thou leading. Such a scent I draw of carnage, prey innumerable, and taste the savour of death. From all things that live, nor shall I to the work thou enterprisest be wanting, but afford thee equal aid." And so saying, with delight he snuffed the smell of mortal change on earth. As when a flock of ravenous fowl, though many a league remote, against the day of battle to a field where armies lie encamped, come flying, lured with the scent of living carcasses designed for death, the following day in bloody fight. So scented the grim feature and upturned his nostril wide into the murky air, sagacious of his quarry from so far. Let me turn to the devil's party. Satan survives the torrid journey through chaos and the abyss and arrives in view of this pendant world. The poem likens the fiend to a ship come to harbour, having barely survived the storm. That Satan, with less toil and now with ease, wafts on the calmer wave by dubious light, and like a weather-beaten vessel holds gladly the port, though shrouds and tackle torn, or in the emptier waste resembling air weighs his spread wings, at leisure to behold far off the imperial heaven, extended wide in circuit, undetermined, square or round, with opal towers and battlements adored of living sapphire, once his native seat, and fast by, hanging in a golden chain, this pendant world, in bigness as a star, of smallest magnitude close by the moon. Thither, full fraught with mischievous revenge, accursed and in a cursed hour he hies. It is pointless to discuss character in Paradise Lost. Those who complain about God as a boring or undeveloped character miss the point. He is not human. That he must simply be obeyed is the very definition of God. There is no scope for character. This is a theological being, not human. He is unavoidably not vulnerable to character. He is not vulnerable to character analysis, and therefore lacking an interest for those seeking the human drama of Shakespeare. The only aspect of God which comes close to vulnerable analysis of his interior life is when the poem deals with the theodicy that lies at the heart of the poem. Why does God permit the fall when he has foreknowledge of it? This is the only time I have a slight sense God is somewhat human, because he is compelled to defend himself. But his primary function in the poem is conventional, and Milton could not risk departing from the bounds prescribed by Scripture, nor would he have wanted to. But the foreknowledge problem is a theological issue, not a character issue. It is different with Satan. There is more scope for character, and that he is fallen provides the opportunity to present his interior life as a great and tragic figure, most identifiable with and to fallen man. But he is a God, not a man. The constraints of Scripture and theology are not as strict as they are with God and Messiah, his Son. This is the way, I think, to understand William Blake's famous quip when he said, "The reason Milton wrote in letters in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet, and of the devil's party without knowing it." But rather than Milton not knowing he was of the devil's party without knowing it, I think it is the reader who joins the devil's party without knowing it, perforce Milton's poetic art. For Satan cuts a magnificent figure, even in despair. Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors, hail, infernal world, and thou profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater? Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. We now turn to Satan, envy, and Eve. Satan is enthralled, nay, in love with Eve and filled with envy. His pursuit and temptation and beguilement of her is absolutely one of the supreme achievements of the poem. Such pleasure took the serpent to behold this flowery pot, the sweet recess of Eve, thus early, thus alone, her heavenly form, angelic but more soft and feminine, her graceful innocence, her every air of gesture and least action overawed, his malice, and with rapine sweet bereaved, his fierceness of the fierce intent it brought. That space the evil one abstracted stood from his own evil, and for the time remained stupidly good, of enmity disarmed, of guile, of hate, of envy, of revenge, but the hot hell that always in him burns, though in mid-heaven, soon ended his delight, and tortures him now more the more he sees, of pleasure not for him ordained. Then soon fierce hate he recollects, and all his thoughts of mischief gratulating thus excites. Thoughts, whither have ye led me? With what sweet compulsion thus transported to forger? What hither brought us? Hate, not love, nor hope of paradise for hell, hope here to taste of pleasure, but all pleasure to destroy, save what is in destroying, other joy to me is lost. Then let me not let past occasion, which now smiles, behold alone the woman, opportune to all attempts. Her husband, for I view far around, not nigh, whose higher intellectual more I shun, and strength of courage, haughty and of limb heroic built, though of terrestrial mould, foe not informidable, exempt from wound, I not so much hath hell debased and pain, enfeebled me to what I was in heaven, she fair, divinely fair, fit love for gods, not terrible, though terror be in love and beauty, not approached by stronger hate, hate stronger, under show of love well feigned, the way which to her ruin now I tend. The hot hell that always within him burns. Keep that line for later. As Leo Tolstoy wrote, in the kingdom of God is within you, so is hell. Let me now turn to Milton's theodicy. The great argument of Paradise Lost is to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. The Almighty Father and Messiah are sitting in heaven, gazing down upon creation and Adam and Eve there. The Father discerns Satan on his mission in blissful solitude. He then surveyed hell and the gulf between, and Satan there coasting the wall of heaven on this side night in the dun air sublime, and ready now to stoop with wearied wings and willing feet on the bare outside of this world that seemed firm land embosomed, without firmament, uncertain which in ocean or in air, him God beholding from his prospect high, wherein past, present, future he beholds, thus to his only Son foreseeing spake, only begotten Son, seest thou what rage transports our adversary, whom no bounds prescribed, no bars of hell, nor all the chains heaped on him there, nor yet the main abyss with wide interrupt can hold. So bent he seems on desperate revenge, that shall redound upon his own rebellious head. And now, through all restraint broke loose, he wings his way, not far off heaven, in the precincts of light, directly towards the new created world, and man there placed with purpose to assay if him by force he can destroy, or worse, by some false guile pervert, and shall pervert, for man will hearken to his glozing lies, and easily transgress the sole command, sole pledge of his obedience. So will fall he and his faithless progeny. Whose fault? Whose but his own? Ingrate. He had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all the ethereal powers and spirits, both of them who stood and them who failed. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given, sincere of true allegiance, constant faith or love, where only what they needs must do appeared, nor not what they would? What praise could they receive? What pleasure I from such obedience paid, when will and reason is also choice, useless and vain, of freedom both despoiled, made passive both, had served necessity, not me. They therefore, as to right belonged, so were created, nor can justly accuse their maker of their making or their fate, as if predestination overruled their will, disposed by absolute decree, or high foreknowledge. They themselves decreed their own revolt, not I. If I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault, which had no less proved certain unforeknown. This, to my mind, is sound theology. Perhaps being Protestant, one of Martin Luther's tribe, Milton's account of the problem of evil in the world and how it is that God's omniscience and foreknowledge does not mean mankind's capitulation to Satan's glozing lies was mankind's choice, does not deviate from the conventional Protestant view. Which brings me to the point about the fidelity of Milton's theology in Paradise Lost with Scripture. Coming from a Protestant faith, wary of departures from the Word of God, I have a sense that Milton's poetic license in extending the story of Genesis, and indeed inventing entire dimensions of the prehistory of creation, I am strangely unperturbed by Milton's idiosyncratic theology as laid out in this epic. The way in which the poem moves between biblical account and allusions to the classical world is, in my view, seamless and naturally profound. Let me now turn to literary memory. At the beginning of Book 3, Milton's narrator speaks to his blindness in this passage, part of his extraordinary invocation to light. Thee I revisit safe, and feel thy sovereign vital lamp, but thou revisit'st not these eyes that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray, and find no dawn. So thick a drop serene hath quenched their orbs, or dim suffusion veiled. Yet not the more cease I to wonder where the muses haunt, clear spring or shady grove or sunny hill, smit with the love of sacred song, but chief thee, Sion, and the flowery brooks beneath, that wash thy hallowed feet and warbling flow. Nightly I visit, nor sometimes forget. So were I equalled with them in renown, thy sovereign command that man should find grace, blind Thamyras, and blind Maeonides, and Tiresias, and Phineas, prophets old. Then feed on thoughts that voluntary move harmonious numbers, as the wakeful bird sings darkling, and in shadiest covert hid tunes her nocturnal note. Thus with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of even or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine. But cloud instead, an ever-during dark, surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men, cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair presented with a universal blank, of nature's works to me expunged and raised, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. So much the rather thou, celestial light, shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate. There plant eyes, all mist from thence purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. T.S. Eliot was inclined to agree with John Keats' assessment that Milton's magnificence led nowhere, that he had damned the creative flow of the English language. Eliot wrote, "To pass under the spell of Milton is to be condemned to imitate him." He wrote, "Milton made a great epic impossible for succeeding generations. Shakespeare made a great poetic drama impossible. Such a situation is inevitable, and it persists until the language has so altered that there is no danger, because no possibility of imitation. Anyone who tries to write poetic drama even today should know that half of his energy must be exhausted in the effort to escape from the constricting toils of Shakespeare. The moment his attention is relaxed or his mind fatigued, he will lapse into bad Shakespearean verse. For a long time after an epic poet like Milton or a dramatic poet like Shakespeare, nothing can be done. Yet the effort must be repeatedly made. For we can never know in advance when the moment is approaching at which a new epic or a new drama will be possible. And when the moment does draw near, it may be that the genius of an individual poet will perform the last mutation of idiom and versification which will bring about that new poetry into being. We still await this last mutation of idiom and versification. It is nigh 370 years later, and the spell of Milton has intimidated all who have followed to produce an epic that stands outside of his spell. Whilst new drama emerged after Shakespeare, unconstrained by his shadow, and whilst certainly new poetry emerged, all attempts at epic poetry have never succeeded in escaping the great and terrible achievement of Paradise Lost. God knows the necessary subject matter is at hand, starting from the fall and humankind's journey east of Eden into history. The babbles of reason, technology, and artificial intelligence, the rise of the Anthropocene, the impending biological wasteland, Malthusian overpopulation, and the human-made climate is all there waiting for the latest mutation of idiom and versification. But as the Dante scholar Anthony Esselin makes so clear, there can be no epic without theology. All the great epic poets and novelists were theologians, from Homer to Tolstoy. Their theology was idiosyncratic and reflected the self-determination of the nearly always crazy theologian. But without this architectonic, there could be no epic. I suspect the place in which we will find heaven and hell will be within the minds of humans. That heaven and hell lies within us. And this is where the next Homer or Milton will find a new good and evil. Finally, let me now close with the end of Genesis. The Archangel Michael is instructed by God to inform Adam of their expulsion from paradise in Book 11. Eve overhears the conversation, and this is her forlorn response. Oh, unexpected stroke, worse than of death. Must I leave thee, paradise? Thus leave thee, native soil, these happy walks and shades, fit haunt of gods, where I had hoped to spend quiet, though sad, the respite of the day, that must be mortal to us both. O flowers that never will in other climate grow, my early visitation and my last at even, which I bred up with tender hand, from the first opening bud, and gave ye names. Who now shall rear ye to the sun, or rank your tribes, and water from the ambrosial fount? Thee, lastly, nuptial bower, by me adorned with what to sight or smell was sweet, from thee how shall I part? And whither wander down into a lower world to this obscure and wild? How shall we breathe in other air, less pure, accustomed to immortal fruits? And then finally in Book 12, Michael leads Adam and Eve to the eastern gates of paradise. The archangel stood, and from the other hill to their fixed station, all in bright array, the cherubim descended on the ground, gliding mysterious as evening mist. Risen from the river o'er the marish glides, and gathers ground fast at the labourer's heel, homeward returning. High in front advanced, the brandished sword of God before them blazed, fierce as a comet, which with torrid heat and vapour, as the Libyan air adust, began to parch that temperate clime. Whereat in either hand the hastening angel caught our lingering parents, and to the eastern gate led them direct and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They, looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms, some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest and providence their guide. They, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary